Hey, Francey.
Hi, Cornell. How are you?
How did I sound?
You sound perfectly clear.
Oh, so do you. I suppose you're standing on some fire escape in LA out of the studio?
Actually, I'm sitting in my apartment looking out at the palm trees swaying in the breeze.
God, I love palm trees. You know,
They're very festive somehow.
well, I come from Ireland, and I always had this fascination when I first visited North Africa, and I saw the palm trees. I'm like, how could anybody fight here with these
I
palm
know.
trees?
And
I'm like,
yet people do.
it's so beautiful, and the heat. Who would want to fight in this heat?
I don't know. I don't understand it. LA is so beautiful, but lots of people fight here. So what can you do?
Yeah, it's crazy. I've read a lot about it. So you actually live in L.A. or New York?
Well, no, I'm actually bi-coastal. LA and Atlanta.
Yeah, you have a lot of fingers and a lot of pies.
I do. It seems busier every day, but I can't complain.
Well, I had struggled with how to introduce you on this podcast. So what I did was I pre-recorded and I basically plagiarized your XG Productions intro page with all of your bio info on it. And for my audience, I would like to. Well, obviously, we'll go through the best case, worst case scenario thing. Not scenario. I keep saying scenario for some reason. But we'll go through the best case, worst case thing in a second. But what are you known for mainly? What is your biggest claim to fame? If you call it fame.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I don't think probably, but whenever I'm introduced, when I do news clips or anything, it's just former federal prosecutor, or you can say I'm a former state and federal prosecutor who specialized in national security and crimes against children. That's fairly simple.
Which is why you're here.
That's right.
Because I have a lot of passions in life, and one of them. Well, I don't know if you looked at my podcast or not, but a lot of them are kind of out there theories on Bigfoot and people with near-death experiences. But on the other side, ever since I've had kids, and I had kids late in life, I'm 50, or I'm 40, almost 49 years old. And ever since I had kids, I had this, thing where I just wanted, it became a passion of mine to keep children safe. And, I've become, part of that community where I'm with other parents, and, everything is so, if you're dropping your kids off to, some parent's house, you have to know them, and it's very important. But
I agree.
And when in best case, worst case, which you co-host, or you're actually the boss? I don't know.
Yes, co-host. We are co-equal co-hosts. Yes.
Really? So Jim isn't the main man?
He is not.
Well, he acts like it.
Well, it was his idea. I have to say, definitely was his idea.
He is a legend, and I will tell you a little story before we go into all of the reasons why you're here. I would like to go into the Michael Jackson thing, because you guys did a pretty was it a 2-part series on the Michael Jackson thing?
Yeah, actually, it might have been 3, because I think I talked to Bobby and Maureen about it first, maybe, or maybe it was just Maureen. I can't remember, but yeah, several parts.
So when you I have so much to talk about, and I know your time is limited, so I'm going to try to squeeze all of this in without sounding like an idiot. But when you I love your best case, worst case. It's one of my favorite podcasts, and I love hearing you and Jim banter and bounce off each other. I think it's one of the best parts of the podcast. And he God help anybody that goes up against him that doesn't know what they're talking about.
So true.
He ripped let's put it in a milder term. He gave the Maddie podcast a good lashing the other day, because they had people that claimed that they were experts that weren't really experts.
Yeah, Jim does not brook fools, that's for sure.
No, man, he is, and I actually private messaged him one day, and I just said thank you for all your hard work, and thanks for keeping kids safe, because in my life, in my opinion, he is a real life hero. He really is.
No, there's no doubt.
He's an awesome character, and I love his whole backstory, which we will not get into, because right after this, he's I'm working on him.
Are you?
Maybe. I'm gonna have to have my facts straight, and I'm gonna have to have like a whole those boards that they have in the police stations, and they have all of everything written down. So I might, like in about 6 months' time, when I have the confidence, I might have him on, or I'll just rip me a new one. But
I think he'd probably be just fine.
Yeah, I love the guy, but anyway, the Michael Jackson thing. You know what? I started to get into this big argument with these Michael Jackson people, and on Twitter, and then I realized that my Twitter account was sorry about that. That's bloody updates. And I realized that my Twitter account was linked to my Talk Tank podcast account, where I mentioned, a few of my podcasts where we're talking about Bigfoot and stuff living in the area. I mentioned kind of where I lived, and I'm like, I better go back and delete all my tweets that I give these Michael Jackson people. Some pushback, because they're crazy. Some of them, they're very, very into Michael Jackson.
Yeah, well, that's true. Some of those people there's plenty of people in the world that are unstable, unfortunately.
Well, it was funny because you told a story about your cheerleading days, and you did a cheerleading thing on Thriller.
Oh yeah.
And I had actually won a bottle of champagne by mimicking Billie Jean's "Beat It." This was in 1997.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, I loved the guy, and I did.
We all did. I mean, there's no doubt that we all did.
Yeah, and I loved him up until and my wife, who is a therapist, and she deals with she works she's a school adjustment counselor, and she deals with these parents, and she deals with a lot of kids, and she wants to adopt everybody. Obviously, we're not financially stable enough to do that, but if we could, we would. We would have a big farm, and we would have all of these children on there, and we would give them as much love as they deserve. But, she watches these kids go in and out of the foster system, and it's heartbreaking. So
it is.
So she was telling me for years, no, he's a scumbag, and I'm like, no, and I stood up for him, and I think it was the documentary that actually swayed me. Once I watched that documentary, and then I listened to your podcast on the documentary, and of course you guys cemented it for me, and then I started looking into it and arguing with people 24/7, and it was terrible.
I know, that's what can happen. There's crazy people.
Well, I also have something else to thank you for, is for me never to look at Aqualung ever the same. That was a great podcast. I love that.
Oh, thanks. I was really worried a little bit. Actually, I was very worried about doing that because it was obviously not anywhere near our format, and so I was concerned. But
now, could you just give a brief description of what that podcast was about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's all about child protection. I mean, I think that Jim and I do a lot of training all over the world on how to keep kids safe, and really kind of what motivates those who want to sexually abuse children. And Cornell?
Yeah, hold on 1 second. What the hell happened there?
I don't know. All of a sudden, we were just disconnected.
I don't know. It must be something in the... and I have to hit the record button again. It's really annoying sometimes. 1 second. Let me see. There is a little button right down at the very bottom, and I can't see it. Oh, there we go. Hold on. There we go. Record. Are you recording on your end, by the way?
I'm not.
Hold on. Where did that go? 1 second. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll start this third-party program, which is a okay. It's been on the whole time. Thank God.
Oh, technical difficulties are a bear for sure.
My God, do you guys get that in your podcast?
We do occasionally have problems, for sure. We use a podcasting software called Zencaster, and sometimes it just fails.
Yeah, that's really, especially when I get somebody like yourself on here, I want everything to go smoothly, and it's kind of unfortunate that.
Well, they've improved. The Zencaster has improved because what they do is it records each side of the conversation natively on the person's laptop, or, well, they can't do phone. It has to be a laptop. Well, I guess it can be a desktop, but it has to be a computer. And then those files get automatically uploaded to the administrator, which is me, to their Dropbox account. And so then we just forward them to our editor to edit.
What's strange here is, like, usually on the on the Skype thing itself, there's usually a little, like, three little dots with a recording option, and it's just disappeared, and it drives me nuts, stuff like this. So hopefully my third party MP3 Skype recorder for 4.51 will pick this up. If not, it's very troubling. But anyway, it seems to be recording because the file size is going up and up. But anyway, so what were we talking about?
You asked the podcast that I did on child protection, and I said that I like to say that children are their own first best line of defense against being abused. And if we're not educating kids and parents and caregivers about what to look for, then we're not giving them the tools they need to defend themselves. And I think one of the major stumbling blocks is that most people, civilians, do not know what motivates sex offenders. And if you don't understand what motivates them, then I think it's very difficult for you to spot red flag behavior that should be able to tell you that there's something to watch out for. And so in that podcast, I talked about understanding offender behavior and what motivates them, and red flags, and some of the myths. I tried to bust some of the myths about quote-unquote predators and who is a predator. And that's why, as you referred to Aqualung by Jethro Tull, I play that and talk to audiences about what the preconceptions are around that kind of image that's on the album cover of Aqualung, and what it does to our, sort of our social culture about what we expect a predator to look like, and how it's not what we expect.
Well, the funny thing about it is, like, we have a little database in town, and there's about 6 or 7 people, and they're all of these, rugged, individuals that look like they just climbed out of a bush, those types. You know the types I mean. They're ugly. They look like they couldn't. They've never been with a woman in their lives, and they somehow. That's who people look for, but they don't look for the good-looking guy. That's what I always say is that it's not the guys that are on the list that you look for. It's the guys that aren't on the list. At least.
Well, that's right, because most people aren't on the list. They're not on anybody's list.
Yeah. No, you had, I think, a sobering statistic, and I think you mentioned it on one of your podcasts. What percentage of men or something was it that had
a sexual interest in children? Yeah, it was 3%.
Yes.
3%, as what social scientists tell us, 3% of the male population have a persistent sexual interest in children under the age of, it's called prepubescent, but say under the age of, around 12. And that's 3%, so you do the math. I mean, it's a really frightening figure if you think about it.
Well, does that mean 3 out of 10 or 3 out of 100? What does that mean again?
3 out of 100. Yeah, 3 out of 100.
Whoa.
3 out of 100, and that's just to be clear, there's a couple of different kinds of, there's a broad spectrum of offenders, child sex offenders, but you've got on one hand, the preferential offender who are in that category that I just listed, those 3% who have a persistent sexual interest in children. But on the other end of the spectrum, you've got situational offenders, and they are almost like, I might call them omnisexual. That is, they'll be sexually interested in anyone who's available, whether it's an adult or a child, if the opportunity arises, if the situation arises, which is why they're called situational offenders. They're not in that 3%. No one has any idea how many of them there are, and they are just awaiting the opportunity to feel like they've got a safe place and enough time to get away with offending against a child, and they will take advantage of that. So we just don't know. We have no idea how many people out there are with enough of a sexual interest in children to actually go on to offend against them.
So what you do is, now you mentioned some of your what you actually do for work and what you did in your past, and what are you actually doing currently to address this situation?
I do a lot of speaking and training, and I have done since since almost I started as a state prosecutor a long time ago now. And as a federal prosecutor, I continued that work, teaching and training. And Jim and I, in fact, were just at the LAPD Chiefs Conference a couple of weeks ago, and I was speaking on a particular case that I had when I was a federal prosecutor, but also talking to these sex crimes detectives about how to spot a predator and the link between child pornography and hands-on offending. And so I do a lot of teaching and training, but I also do some much lighter work now than I did as a prosecutor, and I am working on productions, that is TV, film, podcasts, audible projects, all in the crime space, sort of crime as education and entertainment. So I'm trying to bring my expertise in this area to bear to see if I can't help Hollywood tell stories about crimes that are more authentic.
Well, the problem is that Hollywood is kind of riddled with it too, isn't it?
Yes, no doubt. There's lots of crime and corruption here, but there's lots of crime and corruption everywhere. And, of course, Hollywood has had their own scandals. Jim and I have, I think we've done at least 2 or 3 of our what we call our worst case scenario episodes on best case, worst case, where we talk about something in the news. And in fact, that was our most recent episode as well, where we had Bobby Chacon on talking about a couple of sort of rip from the headlines cases. And Jim and I talked about, in particular, those cases under our worst case scenario banner. And it just seems to be never ending. Hollywood, they make movies, they glorify children as sexual beings sometimes, and they never seem to learn. And the media is just as guilty of it when you hear a story, especially about a female teacher and a male student. It's always called an affair, when what it really is an abusive relationship. But they just never seem to get the narrative to the point where it reflects reality.
Well, a lot of guys have a problem with that. I work in construction, and a lot of guys have a problem with that. Now, that's just coming from my perspective, and they're like, it's not the same. Now, in your opinion, it is the same?
Well, it is the same. I mean, children, whether they're boys or girls, are equally as vulnerable to being groomed by someone in a power position over them, and that is ultimately, in these situations, that is a teacher. The child does not have the capacity or understanding to consent to sex, and I do think that it is the same. When you look at the long-term of boys that are taken advantage of, groomed, and victimized by these adult women, the effects are the same as they are for girls. They have difficulty attaching as adults. They have difficulty forming relationships. They suffer increased incidents of alcoholism, depression, and drug abuse, promiscuity, and difficulty at home while they're still teenagers. So we know it's a 100% fact that these male children experience the same deleterious effects on their maturity as girls do. And so, yeah, I think it's the same thing. But you're right. There is a societal attitude, and especially, I think, among men, and mostly among men, I suspect largely among men who've never experienced abuse. They had some kind of teacher fantasy, or they look at some of these attractive teachers and say, well, if that had been my first sexual experience, I would have welcomed it. But that's coming from a position of ignorance, from a position of not understanding the effects of it, I think. Yeah,
because in my environment, it's like, that guy deserves a slap in the back. That's how I hear it.
No, and you're right, and we hear it that way too, Jim and I, and it drives both of us crazy because it is still sexual abuse, and yet not only do men not think it is serious, but society in general doesn't, and the media doesn't. And I think the sentences, when someone is sentenced for that kind of crime, when it's a female offender and a juvenile male victim, are not nearly as serious or long-term as those when it's the opposite gender.
Well, it's funny. Now, just a little bit of a segue now. We're talking about, like, you're addressing suburbia right now. That was my whole point of having you on the podcast, because I want you to address suburbia and people that have settled down and have kids and, let them have sleepovers and, like, invite people into their houses. We had a thing where it was a graduation party. My little 5-year-old girl, and she is a little sweetie. I mean, and she's like, she goes into the house for something, to go to the bathroom or something, and she doesn't come back out again. So all the, I mean, everyone was doting over her. She lost her balloon at one point and she cried, and every guy in the party was like, "Oh my God!" They were tripping over themselves to make her stop crying, So I thought I was in a safe place, so I go to the bathroom, and actually my wife goes to the bathroom to just check on Kira, and she's sitting watching SpongeBob with these two guys, around in late 50s or something. Mm-hmm. And they're sitting there, and they're being very nice to her, and, laughing, and she's watching SpongeBob, and she comes out to the patio, and she's like, Cornell, there's something not right in that living room, and my alarm bells are, going off. And I'm like, okay, I'll go in and check it out. And these guys should know better. If they're in this situation, they should bring her out to the parents, right? That's what you would normally do.
Especially if they're not her uncles or friends of the family. Yeah.
That's what I would do. If there was a little girl in a living room with me by myself, I would bring her out to the parents and say, "Hey, is this your?" So I went in and I sat down there for a second, and I just got this vibe, and it just, I don't know where it came from. It came from like instinct, I guess. So I just made my excuses and brought her out and told her mum wanted her, but that's one of these cases that probably happens all the time, and I'm like, what the hell? I mean...
Well, Cornell, you bring up such a great point, because our instincts, that fight or flight, the sort of almost ESP that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck, or you think to yourself before you get in an elevator, oh, I don't think I should get in that elevator. Your brain, your front brain, the part that's
I hate elevators, by the way.
Well, everyone does. But it's the part of your consciousness that you're, conscious of, that doesn't explain to you that when you walk into that parking deck at night and all of a sudden you think to yourself, why do I feel like I'm being watched? What you don't know is that your brain, which is like a supercomputer, has taken in all these different factors, the broken light, the fact that there's no one else around, a footfall that you barely heard with your subconscious, has taken all those in and processed them so rapidly that you yourself are not even really aware of it. So it's your instinct screaming at you that you're about to be attacked and to get out, and people ignore that. People ignore that instinct, and so your wife and you probably saw all sorts of verbal cues that you didn't even recognize at the time that you were seeing, but that your brain was processing and telling you to get her out of there.
Yeah, and that's why that's why I enjoy your show so much, because you guys educate, normal people like myself, and a lot of people in the burbs don't listen to podcasts. They haven't figured out what they are yet, because podcasts are relatively new, and they. You have an actual program where people can actually go there and learn, right? Started by...
Well, yeah, we hope so. I mean, we certainly hope so. Our goal is to, bring people behind police lines and show them the human side of law enforcement, really the human impact that dealing with darkness has on people that are just like you and just like your neighbors and just like my neighbors and my family, but are put into these positions of investigating and prosecuting sometimes absolutely horrific things that are beyond normal imaginings, but that, you're still a human and you have to deal with somehow. And Jim and I try very hard to make these interesting and sometimes light. Jim and I, like you said, we banter back and forth. We squabble like siblings. And we try to bring that kind of gallows humor in when we can, because otherwise it can be unremitting darkness, and no one wants to listen to unremitting darkness. But I think the stories that we tell, the people that we bring in to interview, and the cases that they have experienced are fascinating. They fascinate us. We don't know what case they're going to talk about before they talk to us about them. We ask them to tell us nothing about it in advance because we want to learn about the case the same way our listeners are learning about it. So we think it's a great way to bring entertainment and sort of education on crime and criminal topics together.
Okay, so all of this aside, that you must have, not to get too personal, but you must have had some effects of PTSD in stuff you've had to deal with.
It's interesting that you say that. I certainly am not conscious of that. You're probably right. I've never, seen anyone about it, but there's no doubt that, so one of the things, for example, you can't see, there was one episode where I talked about one of the worst cases of my career. Unfortunately, I've had so many bad ones, but one of the worst cases of my career was a child homicide, and the child was only 12 months old. And it was just a horrific death. He was just, beaten to death. And I hadn't really thought about the case in a long time until I was talking about it with Jim and going through it. And I actually surprised myself with my recall of some details that I didn't even really consciously remember until I started talking about them. And when Jim and I finished recording that episode, I just sat there and cried. I didn't cry on the podcast, but I just sat and cried because it really brought up all kinds of memories of the horror of dealing with this child's death and seeing the autopsy photos and, trying to get justice for this poor child, and, whose mother was not responsible for his death and didn't have anything to do with it, and will suffer along with his the child's twin brother, the rest of their lives. And you're right, it's very emotional sometimes, and they say that you're supposed to be able to distance yourself from that and be dispassionate. I just don't know what kind of human being can be dispassionate when faced with the photos of a dead child. I can't. I never could.
Now, did you guys cover the Chris Watts case?
We talked about, I'm not sure Jim and I, we did. We talked about it on a couple of episodes of the podcast, worst case scenario, or we did a few video episodes also, and we definitely talked about Molly Tibbetts and Shannon Watts and some of the other cases that were in the news at the same time. So yeah, I'm familiar with the Shannon Watts and those two beautiful little girls that he killed.
Now, yeah, I get mixed up a lot because RCP and you guys kind of are almost, you do intersect a lot, and I would love to see it. I would love to see a situation where you guys all just to get together and create like a podcast on steroids, because you've all got something that you've all got something to offer. That'd be the best podcast ever. The worst case scenario and RCP together.
That's right.
RCP being Real Crime Profile with Lisa Zambetti,
Jim Clementi, Lisa Zambetti, and Laura Richards.
Oh, they're great together.
Yeah.
Jim's a little hard sometimes, but he's apologized for that.
You have to give to Jim as good as you get, and that's what I do.
But he was right about when he said about those what did you call that documentary that dealt with West Memphis 3, Paradise Lost?
Yes.
And he lost it over that. He was like, there was no reason for the directors to show the naked dead bodies of these 3 young boys, and he just went off about that. And I was like, you know what? He's right. He is absolutely right, and they shouldn't have shown that. And he got a lot of flack for that, and he had to apologize for being so, passionate about it. But
Jim definitely gets passionate about things, and it comes from a very honest place. But yeah, sometimes Jim can get kind of excitable.
Well, he's right though. He's an expert, and like when I was on Twitter arguing with these idiot Michael Jackson fans, they were like putting down Jim. I'm like, I can't believe that you're even questioning Jim's credibility. The guy's a hero, and he knows what he's talking about. So
no, he absolutely does.
What else did I want to talk to you about? God, I mentioned it in my email, and I can't remember. So, what are you doing?
You said you wanted to talk to me about the death penalty.
Oh yes, that was the big one. Because that speech you gave about the death penalty was very, very concise and articulate, and I would love you to reiterate that for my European listeners, because I have a lot of European listeners, obviously, because I'm from Ireland, and half of my audience comes from the UK. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, there's a great example, I think, and one of the biggest reasons I support the death penalty is for cases like, I'm sure even your European listeners have heard about the case of the kidnapping of Jamie Kloss, the Wisconsin 13-year-old girl who was kidnapped and her parents murdered. She was taken for 88 days by the offender, and then she managed to rescue herself by getting free from the room that he had been secreting.
That was recently, right?
Yes, this is a very recent case.
Oh, yes.
Jamie with a Y, Jamie Kloss, Jayme. And just today, I believe, her offender, who pled guilty not too long ago, was sentenced today to life in prison. Now, this was a man who murdered her parents in front of her, and in fact, literally blew her mother's head off with a shotgun right in front of Jamie. Oh. And so Jamie was covered in some, of her mother's blood and other things when he dragged her out of her house, threw her into the trunk of his car after he already killed her father upon entry to the house, and then drove her off to where he lived and kept her captive there for 88 days. Now, this is the kind of torture that, of course, he sexually abused her on a regular basis. And this is a man who is, to this day, according to prosecutors, still obsessed with Jamie Kloss. And he became obsessed with her after literally just driving down a road and watching her get off a bus at her house. And upon seeing her, decided, I'm going to take her. And so planned over weeks and weeks and weeks the murder of her parents and her kidnapping. And so he is exceedingly dangerous and fixated on Jamie Kloss, and I believe he always will be. And yet his sentence, because there's no death penalty, and I think it's Wisconsin, there's no death penalty there, so he was just sentenced to life in prison, which sadly does not actually mean life in prison. He will be eligible for parole at some point.
Now, how old was he, sorry?
21.
Oh, okay.
21 years old.
That says it all.
That's right. He's a man, and he'll be eligible for parole at some point, or he'll get sick, or people will decide that he spent, quote, enough time in prison for the deaths of her parents. And we see it in this country, and in Europe, too. It happens all the time. Murderers get out of prison, and I 100% disagree with that, except in certain circumstances. If you take a life in a premeditated way, like happened here, not only do I believe you should never get out of prison, but I support the death penalty because I think two things. One, you have forfeited your rights by taking the life of someone else. You forfeit your right to life by taking someone else's life. And number two, you've got no way of knowing whether that person will still be a danger in 20 years or 30 years in the same way they are a danger now. There is something fundamentally turned off in the psyche of people who can kill in that kind of premeditated way that we don't understand, will never understand, and those people should not be put back amongst civilians. And so if you prosecute them and they are sentenced to death and the penalty is carried out and they are executed, you never have to worry about them getting out and hurting anyone else, or, as happens occasionally here and in Europe, escaping. Those who are in prison for life escape, And there is some regularity to that. You saw there was a big movie called Escape at Dannemora that Ben Stiller did on murderers.
Oh, yeah, I never
plotting.
seen that. I heard you guys talk about RCP, actually.
Yeah, they talked about it. Plotting and getting out of prison and escaping. There was another case where a murderer, upon his escape from prison, he murdered the warden's 17-year-old daughter on his way out of the compound. So, you just, to me, it isn't worth the risk that they will escape. And then lastly, they are a distinctive behavioral issue. Those who are serving life, especially life without parole sentences, they have literally no incentive to behave. We had a case when I was a federal prosecutor in Atlanta of a man who murdered his cellmate. The man was serving life in prison for another murder. His cellmate was serving a sentence for something, I don't recall what. I think it was actually a child offense. And the murderer killed his cellmate. He said, I didn't like him, and I'll kill the next one you give me. Because what could they do to him? He's never getting out of prison. He has no incentive to behave and follow the rules and not kill people, and especially not kill guards who are in danger from people like that. So for all of those reasons, I believe that certain crimes merit the death penalty.
Even just crimes about like bank robbery and killing
someone?
No.
No. Well, no. Now, the death penalty is generally only available when there are certain special circumstances, they call it. And every state that still has the death penalty, you have to allege those special circumstances. Multiple deaths, the death of a child, the death of a police officer, if the killing was premeditated. Bank robbery might. It just depends. It depends on the circumstances, whether, if you murder a teller in the course of the bank robbery, whether that counts as a death-eligible offense.
Yeah, Europeans have a hard time with that, and they think that America is too hard on its criminals, but Jesus Christ, some of them deserve it.
Well, I very much, we have a lot of listeners in the world on our Best Case, Worst Case podcast.
Right.
In fact, 1/4 of our listeners are outside the country, and they come from Australia, UK, Ireland is a big podcast consumer of ours, the Nordic countries. So we get a lot of listeners from all over the place, and I appreciate their opinions. I respect them. I respect the fact that they do not support capital punishment, but I am not in that camp. I have seen far too many things to agree with them.
But there is no rehabilitation for people who are interested in children.
No, you cannot cure someone who has a sexual interest in children any more than you can cure someone who has a sexual interest in adult women. That is your sexual interest. Can you convince them not to act upon it? That is the question. And who will refrain from sexually abusing children? And who's going to monitor that? Exactly. And, that's another thing that's different between European countries and the U.S. We have mandatory registration, public registration of sex offenders. And that's something that, Europeans have not done and have not gotten on board with. And I just don't understand. I mean, if I'm a parent anywhere in the world, I want to be able to put in my zip code and figure out if I've got a neighbor who's been convicted of a crime against a child. I'm going to be much more careful about what I let my child do in that neighborhood. And I do not understand not wanting that to be the law.
I think in Ireland you've got you can go to the police station and find out, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think that a forewarned public is a forearmed public, and so they understand what to do. They can better protect themselves and their kids if they can see those who represent a threat around them.
Well, this is a podcast basically about we've told our children, the only people who could touch you is a doctor or us, not in the private parts, obviously, a doctor
right.
for that, but no one can touch you, and you come to us and you tell us if someone touches you. And my little podcast is a conduit for suburban families that don't know these things, and
Well, it's important. Oh, no, it's important, and it's something that I don't think as a society, and certainly our education systems are not set up adequately. They're not expert enough, and they're not properly preparing parents, community leaders, and children to handle the idea that there are those that would prey upon them. And we have to do a better job of educating the public so that they can protect themselves.
So, Francey, that brings us to our last question, and you know what it is. I'm just going to plagiarize you. But what is your best kiss?
Oh, wow. Great question.
Many of them, but...
Well, the very first episode of Best Case, Worst Case, that is literally episode 1, is my best case. And it was my very first trial as a state prosecutor. I was fresh out of law school. I had only been in the office a couple of weeks, and it was an aggravated child molestation case that I had to go to trial on. And the victim was, at the time, she was a little 11 or 12-year-old, adorable little redheaded girl who had been abused by her father for many years. Her name was Kimberly. And this was in 1996. And we tried the case, and he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. And I'll never forget sitting with her in my office before we went to trial and talking to her about what happened to her and promising her that I would get justice for her, and feeling that first pressure that would become sort of a hallmark of my prosecution career that I felt for every case. Her father. And so after the case was over, we had become somewhat close, but I lost track of Kim and moved on to other cases. And almost 20 years to the day later, in 2016, she called me. I don't know how she got my phone number. It was not a phone number I had way back in the 90s. She called, and she thanked me for everything that I had done for her, and said that she was graduating from college and she wanted to go on to a career in policing because of me, because of the things that I had said to her, and because I told her that she could do anything or be anything that she wanted. And so while it might not have been my best case at first, it was my first case, it certainly became my best case after talking to Kim and getting that phone call from her.
That deserves a round of applause. If there was a little, like a hook that you could insert a round of applause, but that's pretty awesome. That's really, really good. My wife has a lot of stories like that too.
It's very humbling. It's very humbling to think that just doing your job, which, like your wife, she's a therapist, just doing her job can mean that you can make such an impact on people. And you can, as long as you're doing the right thing and you're trying to help people. I think that we all underestimate the value that we can have in others' lives if we just take the time to be aware and try to protect people and help people.
Okay, so just in case we missed the first 10 or so minutes, I can't remember what we missed, if we did miss anything. Where can people find you?
Well, they can find me on a variety of locations, Cornell. They can find me at Francey Hakes on Twitter. So that's FranceyHakes. I have FranceyHakes.com. And they can also hear me every Friday, and for many episodes going back, 126 episodes, on Best Case, Worst Case. And that is on iTunes and Spotify and Google Play. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can find Best Case, Worst Case.
And what about XG Productions?
XG Productions is my production company, and it is xgproductions.com. And you can find a whole lot of information about what we do there, trying to use Hollywood's money to tell stories about real crime using real experts.
Okay, so you get pulled in to actually consult with these people.
I do. I formally consult. Yep, I formally consult on multiple shows. We're doing different what's called scripted and unscripted, so fictional stuff and documentary series, and even working now on a couple of feature films, all that relate to telling crime stories and using our expertise to try to tell those stories that entertain people, engage people, educate people with authenticity.
Now, are you working on any specific shows at the minute?
I am, but until they're public, I can't talk about them.
Right. And what? Just before you go, what shows have you worked on?
Last year, well, I've worked on several that haven't quite been aired yet, but one of the ones that I worked on that has come out was an Oxygen show called The Case of Kaylee Anthony, all about the Casey Anthony murder of her daughter, Kaylee.
Oh, that's a tough one.
That was a tough one.
Yeah, that was a punch a hole through the wall kind of case.
Absolutely, it absolutely was. So I was a producer or consulting producer on that particular series.
Well, Francey, I swear to God, it's been such an honor to have you on the show. I'm a big fanboy.
Well, thank you, Pernell. I really appreciate
You're
that.
You're one of my heroes.
And you're so nice.
No, you really are. You're out there fighting the good fight, and you and Jim, and I hope you keep doing what you're doing, and I really thank you for coming on the show, and it was nice to talk to you finally.
You too, Cornell. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with your listeners.
Okay, I will talk to you soon, Francey.
Okay, thanks, Cornell.
All right, bye now.
Bye now.